What happens when peace talks become targets? On a quiet night in Doha, the world watched in disbelief as Israel launched an airstrike in Qatar. This was not Gaza, not Lebanon. This was the heart of the Gulf. The Israel Airstrike Doha operation targeted Hamas leaders in what Israel described as a precision strike. The news spread instantly. Israel strikes Hamas in Qatar, shaking not just the region, but the very foundation of international diplomacy. For the first time, Israeli airstrikes on Doha reached beyond conventional battlefields. A city known for negotiations and diplomacy had suddenly turned into a war zone. Families in Doha woke to blasts, smoke, and chaos. Analysts described it as a turning point, with the Israel's latest airstrike breaking every norm of sovereignty. Questions immediately rose. How could Israel launch airstrikes in Qatar without igniting a diplomatic firestorm? What does this mean for peace talks? From Israel airstrikes Qatar to the Israel military strike Doha, the operation wasn't just a tactical hit, it was a symbolic move. Israel claimed it was targeting Hamas decision-makers, but the ripple effect was far greater. The incident has been called the day peace talks died. For Qatar, a mediator of conflicts, this was more than just a Qatar airstrike. It was an attack on its role in global diplomacy. And the world wants to know, was this a necessary blow against terrorism or a dangerous gamble that could ignite the entire Middle East?
We meet today to address the critical issues facing our world.
Qatar has long positioned itself as a mediator in Middle East conflicts, hosting talks between Israelis, Palestinians, and regional actors. But everything changed with the Israel airstrike Qatar. The small Gulf nation, known for diplomacy, suddenly became a battlefield. For decades, Doha was seen as neutral ground. Yet on this night, it became the front line. According to reports, Israel strikes Hamas leaders in Qatar, who were meeting to discuss a US-backed ceasefire proposal. The precision strike killed Hamas officials and a Qatari security officer, sparking outrage. For many observers, the Israel strike Doha was more than a military move. It was a warning. No place is safe, not even the host of peace talks. The narrative from Israel was straightforward. Israel attacks Hamas in Qatar because Hamas leadership had abused Qatar's neutrality to plan operations. From Qatar's perspective, the strike was a violation of sovereignty and international law. This was an attack on our nation, not just Hamas, Doha declared. The Israel strike Qatar instantly drew condemnation from the UN, Gulf states, and European nations. Diplomats argue that the Israel launches airstrike in Qatar undermines years of peacebuilding. For ordinary Qataris, the fear of further Israeli airstrikes on Doha has left a scar. For Hamas, it was a devastating blow in what was supposed to be a safe haven. This Israel airstrike Qatar marked the first time the Gulf nation had been directly dragged into the Israel-Palestine war zone. And it reshaped Qatar's role from mediator to victim. The Israel military strike Doha was no random attack. Reports suggest Israeli intelligence tracked Hamas leaders moving into Doha for high-level discussions. At the very moment when talks about a ceasefire were underway, Israeli jets carried out the Israel airstrike Doha. The result? 5 Hamas members dead, including the son of a top negotiator. Eyewitnesses described the strike as precise, yet terrifying. The ground shook, windows shattered, said a Doha resident. This was not Gaza. This was Qatar's capital city, one of the wealthiest and safest places in the Gulf. The Israel strike Doha exposed Qatar to the horrors of war it had only ever hosted as a neutral mediator. Israel justified the attack, saying, Hamas leaders are not safe anywhere. Officials insisted that the Israel strikes Hamas in Qatar prevented future attacks on Israeli civilians. But critics argue this was less about Hamas and more about sending a geopolitical message. Israel will strike anywhere, anytime. The Israel airstrike Qatar operation has left the global community divided. Supporters say it proves Israel's determination to destroy Hamas. Opponents argue that Israeli attack on Hamas in Doha undermines international law and drags neutral states into conflict. For the people of Doha, this was the first time their skyline echoed with war. The Israel's latest airstrike wasn't just about killing leaders. It was about shifting the rules of engagement. Now, even safe havens aren't safe anymore.
We gathered today to address a matter of urgent international concern.
Within hours of the Israel airstrike Qatar, the world responded. The UN Security Council convened an emergency meeting. Arab states called it a violation of sovereignty. European nations expressed grave concern, and the Gulf reacted with fury. For Qatar, this wasn't just a Qatar airstrike, it was a humiliation on the global stage. The UAE and Saudi Arabia condemned the Israel strikes Qatar, warning of unprecedented escalation. The EU called the Israel airstrike Doha a reckless act that endangers diplomacy. Even Washington, Israel's closest ally, expressed unease, though carefully balanced its statement. The outrage stems not only from the act itself, but from what it represents. If Israel can carry out Israeli airstrikes on Doha, what's stopping similar attacks in other neutral nations? Critics fear a dangerous precedent where peace mediators become war targets. International law experts argue the Israel strike Qatar violates sovereignty. It's one thing to hit Hamas in Gaza, it's another to carry out Israel airstrikes Doha in a sovereign non-combatant state, said one analyst. Qatar vowed to pursue accountability in international courts. But beyond legal measures, the strike has already changed the geopolitical map. For years, Doha was a trusted mediator. Now, after the Israel airstrike Qatar, every negotiation it hosts will be overshadowed by the memory of that night.
Good morning, everyone.
The Israel airstrike Qatar placed Washington in a uniquely uncomfortable position. On one hand, the U.S. has long supported Israel's right to defend itself against Hamas. On the other, Qatar is a close ally, home to the largest American military base in the Middle East. When Israel strikes Hamas in Qatar, it puts the U.S. in the crossfire of diplomacy and military strategy. The official White House statement called the Israel latest airstrike concerning, while reiterating Israel's right to self-defense. But behind closed doors, reports suggest American officials were furious. Qatar hosts not only U.S. forces, but also critical peace talks. The Israel military strike Doha endangered U.S. assets and threatened delicate negotiations Washington itself was backing. Analysts say this was the ultimate diplomatic headache. How could the U.S. publicly support its ally Israel while not alienating its Gulf partner Qatar? The Israeli airstrikes on Doha forced Washington to walk a fine line: condemnation without rupture, criticism without consequence. Critics argue the U.S. cannot remain neutral forever. If Israel airstrikes Qatar become more frequent, America's military presence in Doha could be at risk. The Israel strike Qatar could even push Qatar closer to rivals like Iran or Turkey, reshaping alliances. For now, the U.S. insists the Israel airstrike Qatar was not coordinated with Washington. But the silence is telling. Every move America makes in the Middle East is now viewed through the lens of this attack. And for President Biden, it's a crisis that threatens both diplomacy and U.S. credibility.
This situation demands our immediate attention and decisive action.
Across the Middle East, the Israel strike Doha has triggered shockwaves. From Riyadh to Tehran, leaders condemned the move. The Israel attacks Hamas in Qatar operation may have been aimed at Hamas, but it landed as a political earthquake across the Gulf. Saudi Arabia and the UAE, usually cautious with words, issued strong condemnations, warning Israel not to repeat such actions. Oman called it a violation of international norms. Iran seized the opportunity, declaring that the Israel airstrike Qatar proves Israel is a rogue state. Turkey, too, warned of serious consequences for regional security. The most striking reaction came from Qatar itself. Officials declared the Israel military strike Doha an attack on sovereignty. Thousands of Qataris marched in protest, demanding accountability. The Qatar airstrike became a rallying cry in the Arab world. Even countries quietly cooperating with Israel, like Bahrain, expressed unease. The Israel strikes Hamas leaders in Qatar complicated existing normalization efforts under the Abraham Accords. Diplomats whispered that this one strike may undo years of careful progress. Regional analysts warned the Israel airstrikes Doha could push Gulf states into rethinking alliances. If Qatar feels abandoned, it might lean closer to Iran or forge stronger ties with Turkey. That would mean a major geopolitical shift, reshaping power balances in the Gulf. This was not just an Israel strike Qatar. It was a strike at the fragile web of diplomacy holding the Middle East together. And the aftershocks are only beginning. The Israel airstrike Doha had a clear target: Hamas leadership. For Israel, this was about eliminating decision-makers responsible for planning attacks. "Wherever Hamas hides, we will strike," declared an Israeli spokesperson. The Israel strikes Hamas in Qatar reinforced that message with deadly precision. But the fallout for the peace process is enormous. Hamas officials killed in the Israel airstrike Qatar were reportedly discussing a ceasefire proposal. With their deaths, negotiations collapsed overnight. Mediators warned that the Israel military strike Doha might have permanently damaged chances for dialogue. For Hamas, the Israel strikes Hamas leaders in Qatar was a devastating loss, but also a propaganda gift. They framed it as proof that Israel disrespects international law. The group vowed revenge, further escalating tensions. Observers note that the Israel airstrike Qatar may have been tactically successful but strategically risky. By hitting Hamas in Doha, Israel removed key figures, but also destroyed the negotiating table. The Israel latest airstrike made diplomacy look futile. Qatar's role as mediator now hangs by a thread. After hosting years of talks, it must ask, can it still serve as neutral ground after the Israeli attack on Hamas in Doha? Many believe this was the end of Qatar's credibility as a peace broker. The Qatar airstrike didn't just kill Hamas leaders, it may have killed the peace process itself. The world is now asking, what happens after the Israel strikes Qatar? Will this be remembered as a one-time Israel latest airstrike, or the beginning of a dangerous new era where even neutral countries become targets? Experts fear escalation. Qatar could reduce cooperation with Washington. Gulf unity may fracture. Hamas may retaliate. And Israel, emboldened by the Israel airstrike Doha, may strike elsewhere. The precedent has been set. Israel launches airstrikes even in neutral capitals. For Israel, the justification remains clear. Hamas is not safe anywhere. But the long-term cost of the Israel strike Qatar may outweigh the immediate gain. Already, the Israel airstrike Qatar has isolated Israel diplomatically, angered allies, and empowered its enemies. For the Middle East, the stakes are higher than ever. If every mediator becomes a target, how can peace ever be achieved? The Israeli airstrikes on Doha were a tactical victory, but may prove to be a strategic disaster. The world now watches closely. The question is no longer just about Israel and Hamas. It's about whether diplomacy itself can survive in a world where negotiations are bombed before they even begin. And so, the Israel military strike Doha may be remembered as more than just a headline. It could be the moment the Middle East crossed a line it cannot return from.